Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology for Exercise at Level 2. This is webinar number 6 in the series, looking at the respiratory system, and this ties in really quite well and very tightly to the last webinar on the circulatory system. I know that the lungs were mentioned there, and we talked about the lungs bringing oxygen into the body and getting rid of carbon dioxide as well. But during this unit, we'll break down exactly how that happens. And in particular, we'll know the structure and function of the respiratory system, and we'll be able to identify where the lungs are in the body, describe the function of the lungs, and also look at their structure. So what do they do and how are they made up? We'll be able to identify the main muscles involved in breathing and what their role is, and when they contract and relax, what happens there. We'll be able to describe the passage of air through the respiratory tract. And what that means is we'll be able to identify that air enters through the mouth, it moves down, it goes into the lungs, it goes around the body, it goes here, there, it comes out. We'll know the exact process that air follows around our body. And finally, we'll be able to describe the process of gaseous exchange in the lungs. So essentially, how do we get oxygen into the bloodstream, and how do we get carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream so that we can breathe it out. It's not a long one, guys, 15-20 minutes here, so get your notepads ready and let's go. And the first thing I want to look at is this table, alright? And this table shows us the makeup of the air that we breathe in, and the question at the top says, what does this chart tell you? And in a classroom setting, we'd probably open this up for a little bit of discussion, but we are delivering this online, so I'm going to tell you what my thoughts are, and hopefully they concur with what you're thinking when you see the numbers. And firstly, we're going to look at the nitrogen. Nitrogen for me is quite shocking, because when I was younger, I think when I was at school, I used to be of the opinion that all of the air we breathed in was made of oxygen, and everything that we breathed out was carbon dioxide. And that's not the case. We can see it at 79%, so a big, high, massive proportion of the air that we breathe in, and we breathe out as well, is made of nitrogen. We've then got oxygen and carbon dioxide. We know that we have to breathe oxygen in to use it to create energy in the muscles, okay? And we've got carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that's created when we breathe in. As a waste product of us using oxygen to create energy, a waste product there is carbon dioxide, so we have to get rid of that. And 21% of the air that we breathe in is made of oxygen, and 17% that we breathe out, that's what's left of the oxygen. So we're only using 4% of the oxygen that we breathe in, and yet that's not very high. As I said, I used to think we breathed it all in, used it all, turned it all into carbon dioxide and breathed it out. It's not the case. And the carbon dioxide tab at the bottom, that reflects that as well. You can see less than 1% of what we breathe in is carbon dioxide. And then when we breathe out, it's still only at 4%. So we're not talking big, massive numbers at all there. We're only using 4% of the oxygen we breathe in. And it's only, that 4% is then transferred and turned into carbon dioxide, which we then breathe out. And you need to be aware of this table and the numbers in it, in particular the oxygen, because that does quite often come up on the exam. And we've just touched on it, but when we breathe in oxygen, it's so that we can create energy. And a byproduct or a waste product of us doing that is carbon dioxide, which is what we need to breathe out. Let's have a little bit of a look here at the basic path that the air follows to get into our body. So we breathe in through our nose. We then come in through the pharynx, through the throat there, further down to the larynx, which is sort of like around the voice box area. So it goes nose, pharynx, larynx. We then get into the trachea, alright? The trachea, its more basic name is the windpipe, so our breathing pipe. Once we've gone through the trachea, we get to the lungs, and that's where the exchange happens, and where the oxygen that we've breathed in gets transferred into the bloodstream, and the carbon dioxide that we want to get rid of, it gets transferred into the windpipe, and we breathe it out. but we do need to be aware, we need to be clear on the order that the air follows, and it's nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, lungs, and then at the bottom there, it's not part of where the air flows, but we've got the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is a muscle that assists us with our breathing. As it contracts and relaxes, it changes the way and the shape of our lungs, and we'll look at that in a little bit more depth. And just touching back to the point at the start before we do get onto the diaphragm, the circulatory system is very closely related to the respiratory system, because once we bring in that oxygenated blood, once we have the oxygenated blood in the bloodstream, it has to go to the heart to get pumped around, and the waste product, the blood that contains CO2, that has to come to the heart to be transferred back to the lungs so that we can breathe it out, okay? And so just be aware that those systems are working very closely together. And I think we've covered this off, but the function of the lungs is to take in oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. And the lungs are located, they're inside the chest, they're inside the thoracic cavity, they're protected by the ribs, and they're very close to the heart. One lung is on one side of the heart, and one lung is on side the other there. And we've just got a cross section of the breathing muscles. So the heart and the lungs will sit inside the rib cage here, and just below there you can see we've got the diaphragm. Diaphragm is a sheet of muscle that helps us with our breathing. It connects onto the rib cage, also connects onto the spine as well. And then at the side we've got the intercostal muscles. So the diaphragm's at the bottom, it's underneath, and then at the side, in between the ribs, we've got something called the intercostal muscles. And let's have a little bit of a look at how that diaphragm helps us to breathe, okay? And what we should be taking away from this diagram here, when we breathe in, the lungs get big and they get full of oxygen and air. When we breathe out, we squeeze it all out and the lungs get smaller, and the air is pushed out through the windpipe and we breathe it out. And it's the diaphragm that assists with this process of enabling the lungs to be nice and big to take in more air, or squeezing them and making them small to push that out. So let's break that down a little bit more. So when we breathe in, that's called inspiration, and when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts, the intercostal muscles also contract, the rib cage expands, and the lungs will inflate and fill with air. So important to know, when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts, and when the diaphragm contracts, it gets lower, therefore there's more space for the lungs to expand into. The intercostal muscles, they also contract, creating more space as well. When we breathe out, which is expiration, the process is reversed. So the diaphragm relaxes and it moves up. The rib cage returns to normal with the intercostal muscles there, and the lungs deflate and the air is removed and pushed out. And that process keeps, going backwards and forwards. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, and that's how we breathe. Okay, so we already know what the trachea is. Trachea is our windpipe, and after we come down the windpipe, we then have two areas called bronchus, okay? And it's a little bit like a tree. The trachea is the main branch. The bronchus are the first two other branches. So our main tree trunk branches off into two branches that are called bronchus. The bronchus then gets smaller and they go into what's called bronchioles, alright? And at the end of all the bronchioles, we have something called alveoli. So let's just recap. Trachea is our tree trunk, then breaks into two main branches, and the air is flowing through all the time, breaks into two main branches, which are the bronchus. We then have the bronchus breaking into bronchioles, which are smaller branches on the tree, and then we have the even smaller branches, look a little bit like leaves, a little bit like broccoli, are the alveoli, okay? And the alveoli are very important because this is where the diffusion takes place. This is where the oxygen gets into the bloodstream, and this is where the CO2 gets out. So we can see that on top of these alveoli there are lots and lots and lots of capillaries, alright? And if we remember back from when we looked at the circulatory system, capillaries are where the gaseous exchange takes place, and that's why they're on top of the alveoli. They're tiny, tiny, tiny capillaries, alright? And the alveoli are there, the air flows into them, and then it passes into the, if it's oxygenated blood, it will pass into some of the red capillaries there, and it will go back and it will find its way to the heart. If it's deoxygenated blood, it will find its way back into the alveoli, then into the bronchiole, then into the bronchus, then into the trachea, and it will be breathed out of the body because it's a waste product. Okay, and the way the oxygen, for example, moves into the capillaries is through a process called diffusion. And I know we've mentioned it a few times, but we haven't exactly said what diffusion is. Diffusion is the movement of a substance from a high area of concentration to a low area of concentration. So let's say, for example, we've just breathed in, and in that air there are lots and lots of oxygen molecules. But inside the red blood cells that have just got rid of their carbon dioxide, there aren't any. So what will happen, they'll go from a high area of concentration where there are lots of them, they'll move into an area of lower concentration. Okay? And that's the process of diffusion. It's, for our level 2 qualification, we just need to know it's moving from a high area of concentration into a lower area of concentration. And this is exactly how that happens, okay? So we can see the bronchiole and we can see the alveoli there, alright? This is not sort of exactly what they look like, but to break it down for our understanding here, they've been simplified a little bit, okay? And next to the alveoli, you've got a capillary running across the top of the alveoli, okay? And inside that capillary, you've got red blood cells, which are the red circles. And what we can see is that some of these red circles are containing CO2, which is the blue triangle, okay? So they've been around the body and they've collected some CO2. They've got some waste product with them that they want to get rid of. So what they'll do, through the process of diffusion, the CO2 will diffuse into the alveoli and that will get breathed out, okay? Oxygen, which is the yellow hexagon shape there, that's being breathed into the body. And what happens is that comes into the alveoli and that will then diffuse into the red blood cells that have just got rid of their CO2. So the red blood cells come through diffusion, they'll drop off this CO2 ready for it to be gotten rid of, and then because the red blood cells are then free, they'll then collect some oxygen to be taken around the body. And here's the journey of the air that we spoke about, and there's a lot of words. I guess I know it's a very busy slide. There's a lot to look at, but if you know the process, you'll be able to go through it. And once we talk it through, it won't seem quite so complicated. So when we breathe in through the nose and the mouth. The air then comes through the pharynx and the larynx, so the throat and just by the voice box there, travels through the trachea, which is our big tree trunk. It then goes into the bronchus, which is the first big branch. After the first big branch, it goes into the bronchioles, which are some of the smaller branches, and eventually it makes its way to the alveoli, which are like the leaves, the things that look like the broccoli. Inside the alveoli, gaseous exchange takes place, and the capillaries will get oxygenated blood transferred into them. Okay, they'll take that on board. From there, we go through the pulmonary vein, as we talked about in the circulatory system. Through the pulmonary vein, we'll then go to the left atrium and the left ventricle, and we'll go out to the body through the aorta. Okay, so the aorta joins in to the left ventricle and pumps the blood around the body. As it's going around the body, it may go into arteries or arterioles and capillaries so that it can get diffused into the muscle. Okay? At that point then, when it's diffused into the muscle, we'll then be collecting the deoxygenated blood. So the red blood cells will be taking the deoxygenated blood and they'll be moving their way through the venules and the veins eventually making their way to the vena cava. The vena cava is that big vein that goes into the heart, and it will then go through the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it will then be pumped back round to the lungs through the pulmonary artery that will do that. And then in reverse, really, the capillaries will transfer out that deoxygenated blood into the alveoli, and it will be breathed out through the bronchioles, the bronchus, the larynx and the pharynx, the nose and the mouth, and we'll breathe it out. Alright? Hope that makes sense, and as always, replay it if you need to, guys. So, pretty much finished on this one. It was short, it was nice and sweet. We should know where the lungs are, inside the ribcage, just by the heart being protected in there. We know the function of the lungs, which is to breathe in oxygen and to breathe out carbon dioxide. We know the structure of the lungs. We know that we've got the trachea, the bronchus, the bronchioles, the alveoli. Okay? We know the main muscles involved in breathing, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, making the ribcage nice and wide so we can get in more air, or making it small so that it's pushed out. We also know the passage of the air through the respiratory system, which we've just identified. And we can describe the process of gaseous exchange. So that's where we've got those red blood cells flowing around the capillaries on top of the alveoli, and we've got the diffusion going on to get that get the carbon dioxide out and to get the oxygen in. The next one in the series, guys, we are getting towards the end now. The next one in the series is on energy systems, so I hope to see you there. It's another interesting one, and good luck. Well done.